Welcome all viewers to our channel. We are glad to see you here, where we share amazing stories from people's lives. Each of you is important to us and we will be interested to know what country and city you are from. Please write about it in the comments. Now let's move on to our first story. Night was descending on the city. The dim street lights reflected blurrily in the wet asphalt, creating an ominous atmosphere of silence. In the police car, driving slowly through the deserted streets, Officer John Harrison felt in his element. He was the one who kept order, the one who stood between law and chaos. In his mind he had long ago formed a clear division between us and them. To him, them was always a potential threat, especially those who looked different from him. Harrison had long ago lost his sense of doubt. His patrols had become hunting rather than peacekeeping. Every moment at his post, he caught himself thinking that the next intruder was somewhere close at hand. His hands gripped the steering wheel with tension and his eyes scanned the streets predatorily. He believed he was the one keeping the world in check. He believed he knew who the danger was, and he knew that if a black man was driving an expensive car, something was wrong. Driving through a poor section of town, Harrison saw a black SUV parked at the curb. The driver inside seemed too calm, too confident. Harrison squinted his eyes. The car was clearly not cheap, and the driver, well, the officer had long ago learned not to be ceremonious with the likes of him. Drugs, weapons, maybe a stolen car? Harrison's thoughts raced through his head at breakneck speed, fueled by years of hatred and suspicion. He no longer remembered how many times he'd stopped such drivers for no real reason, just following his preconceived instincts. But this night his bias had been particularly acute. Something about this driver had triggered an internal explosion of suspicion and anger in him. Harrison signaled, forcing the car to stop. There wasn't an ounce of doubt in his actions. He was sure he was doing the right thing. He felt a rush of adrenaline, a rising anger mixed with anticipation. This was going to be another routine stop, but something inside him was beginning to tingle, the sense of power and superiority he felt every time he could put those he considered inferior in their place. As he approached the car, he tapped sharply on the window with his baton, not even bothering to explain the reason for the stop. The driver, sitting calmly inside, slowly rolled down the window. His gaze was calm, even indifferent. It pissed Harrison off even more. How dare he look at him as if he were just another human being? He was expecting fear, expecting submission. License and registration. Harrison exhaled the order without taking his eyes off the driver. The man inside the car silently filed the papers, his hands moving calmly and confidently. Not a shadow of worry, not a hint of panic. Harrison felt a wave of irritation wash over him. So calm, so confident. This guy was obviously hiding something. A voice exploded in the back of his mind. He's one of them. He's definitely involved in something. Get out of the car, he barked, no longer controlling his tone. The man raised an eyebrow slightly, but still calmly opened the door and stepped out. His figure was sturdy, his posture confident. Harrison felt his anger rising. This man was not afraid of him, and he should have been. He was a threat simply by the fact of his existence in this neighborhood, in this car, in this body. Too confident, too bold for his position. Hands on the hood. Harrison's voice sounded like a general's order on the battlefield. The man silently obeyed. His hands slowly rested on the hood of the SUV. Harrison grabbed his hands, pressed him harder than necessary, feeling the fire of power that demanded release. It was wrong, but he couldn't stop. The adrenaline was going off the charts. The man sighed quietly and mouthed, "You don't know anything, cop." The words sounded like a clap of thunder. Harrison jerked the man sharply, nearly throwing him to the ground. He was at his limit. Anger overwhelmed him, but something in the detainee's calmness was beginning to alarm him. Who was this man, and why wasn't he fighting back? The man's words echoed in his head. "You don't know nothing, cop." Suddenly a siren sounded. Another car came out of the darkness into the light. It was an SUV with flashing blue lights, but they were not police officers. The doors swung open, and several men in black jackets labeled FBI stepped out into the street. Harrison was stunned. Harrison sat in his patrol car, watching a black SUV with tinted windows roll slowly down the street. He immediately felt the familiar prick of irritation. You don't see cars like that in this neighborhood. It wasn't the kind of contingent that drove past poor neighborhoods, and certainly not at this time of day. He was used to acting on instinct, developed by years of patrolling in neighborhoods where he believed danger lurked around every corner. And, of course, There was no more obvious red flag to him than a black man driving an expensive car. A picture quickly formed in his mind: either this guy was on drugs or connected to something worse, or maybe just a stolen car. These thoughts lit his suspicion like a match. He knew there was no real reason for the stop, no violations, normal speed, but that didn't matter to Harrison. He'd already identified this driver as a threat just by the mere fact of his existence on the road in such a vehicle. Pressing his lips into a thin line, he abruptly turned on his blinkers and signaled to stop. A wave of excitement rose in his chest. He knew he was ready for the job, ready to show this driver who was boss. In his mind, he could already see the news headlines about how he'd made a big score: drugs, guns, anything to justify his actions. The SUV rolled smoothly to the curb and stopped. The driver didn't try to get away, didn't break the rules. Everything was going smoothly, which only fueled the hatred inside Harrison more. Too sure of himself, he's hiding something. Harrison stepped slowly out of the patrol car, trying to maintain an icy calm, but inside he was filled with anger. How dare this black man drive so brazenly through his city, in his neighborhood, and think he could get away with it? He headed for the driver's car, barely restraining himself from spewing his hatred before it was too late. He went to the window of the SUV and banged the baton on the glass again, aggressively, with the clear intention of showing who was in charge. The glass slowly rolled down, and Harrison finally saw the driver. The black man was sitting calmly, his face showing no emotion, which made the policeman even angrier. He expected to see panic, fear, submission, but instead, the man looked at him with a cold, almost indifferent confidence. "License and registration," Harrison muttered, barely restraining himself from pouncing on him right here and now. The driver silently handed over the documents, moving with frightening calmness. It was as if he didn't care at all. Harrison felt a wave of rage rising inside him. His hands trembled with tension. That bastard knows something. He's up to something. He took a quick glance at the ID. The driver's license was in the name of James Collins. Standard paperwork. No suspicion at all. But that meant nothing to Harrison. The name could be fake. The papers could be stolen. He didn't believe a word. A single document that fell into his hands if the man in front of him didn't meet his internal standard of a decent citizen. And this man certainly did not. "Get out of the car," he said in a harsh tone, no longer bothering to be polite. The man calmly obeyed the order. He got out of the car so slowly and measuredly that Harrison almost lost patience. Why is he being so slow? He's obviously hiding something. A red light went on in his head. Something was wrong here. This had to be the culprit, and he had to prove it. He could already see himself putting this man on the ground, handcuffing him and beating a confession out of him. People like that need to be broken before they start breaking us. When the man stood beside the car, Harrison stepped closer, staring at him intently. Collins's body was strong, with a noticeable poise. This guy looked like a professional, and that made him even angrier. Some cocky criminal, probably a gang member, acting like he owned the situation. Harrison couldn't let that happen. "Hands on the hood," he ordered sharply, trying to put the full force of his authority into his voice. The man obeyed silently, his face still unfazed. Harrison gritted his teeth. One thought echoed in his head: he's kidding. He thinks I won't be able to charge him with anything. The policeman shoved the man sharply onto the hood of the SUV, pinning him down with such force that the man nearly hit his head. Harrison felt his adrenaline kicking in. This was the moment he'd been waiting for. "You're not getting away, you bastard," Collins sighed quietly and said, looking at the officer over his shoulder. "You don't know anything, cop." The words sounded like a slap in the face. Harrison felt the ground slipping away from under his feet. Something cracked inside him, but he couldn't figure out what it was. Who was he to say that? He was about to say something in response, but the sirens sounded. Several black SUVs came around the corner and stopped at the curb. Men in black body armor with FBI written on them jumped out of the vehicles. Harrison was stunned. Questions began to swirl in his head, but the only thing he could squeeze out was mute shock. What the hell? One of the agents approached him without dignifying him with a glance. The man turned to Collins and nodded briefly. "It's okay, Agent Collins, we got this." Harrison felt the world crumble around him. Harrison stood in front of James Collins, his heart racing. The whole picture playing out in front of his eyes did not make sense. How could this man, this brash, cocky black man, be an FBI agent? A storm raged inside him, and each new realization intensified the anger. He looked at Collins again, his clothes an expensive suit that fit his muscular figure perfectly, his mannerisms too calm, too confident, and that look that pissed Harrison off more than anything else. It was as if he were looking down on him. No respect went through the policeman's mind. He looks at me like I'm nothing. That look is everything I hate about them. To Harrison, the black man in the expensive suit and expensive car was like a menace come to life. His clothes, his car, his manner, all of it seemed to scream that this man wasn't just driving around the neighborhood. Inside Harrison grew a fierce desire to break this man, to see the fear in his eyes that would remind him who was in charge. He remembered every time he'd seen people like him, confident, head held high, as if they didn't obey the rules. Every time they'd managed to get away with it, using their connections or their money. These memories only added fuel to the fire. Confident means definitely guilty. There's something wrong with that look. They're all like that. Collins stood before him, calmly waiting to see what would happen next. There was no fear in his gaze, and it fueled Harrison's anger even more. He could not bear this cold certainty. Why isn't he afraid of me? Why doesn't he try to run away or resist? What the hell are you doing here? Harrison exhaled, shoving the man roughly back against the hood. His voice was already breaking into a shout. The FBI agent raised an eyebrow again, as if he didn't care what was going on. I told you already, you don't know anything, Collins replied calmly again, as if he was just witnessing a show that didn't concern him directly. This calmness, this certainty, was unbearable for Harrison. He felt hatred boiling up inside him. In front of him was a man who played the role of innocent victim, but in fact this man was for him the embodiment of all that he was fighting against. In his gaze he read a challenge, a silent protest against everything Harrison represented. They're always like that, they think they're above the law. And although an inner realization grew in him that he had made a monstrous mistake, he couldn't stop. It was his way of controlling the situation. It's too late to admit a mistake. Now we must go all the way. The policeman came close to Collins and grabbed him by the neck, squeezing him with such force that his fingers cut into the man's skin. Collins, however, did not move, did not flinch, did not show any fear. Harrison was furious. He expected to see panic, expected to see the man begin to plead with him, but instead Collins remained as confident as he had been before. You don't realize who you're messing with, Harrison muttered, feeling his own words lose their power. I can make your life a living hell. Collins smiled quietly with the corners of his lips, and that smile was the last straw. Harrison felt the rage exploding in his head. He threw Collins to the ground with such force that the man fell to his knees. Break him down. Show who's in charge here, no matter who he is. No one has the right to humiliate me with that look. But even lying on the ground, Collins continued to maintain his frightening equanimity. His eyes seemed to pierce Harrison like icy needles. It was like a mute sneer. In that moment Harrison realized his accustomed power, his badge, his baton, his right to use force had no power over this man. This black man was completely different. Harrison realized that this time his power was unable to protect him from the consequences. Harrison felt himself boiling inside. There was no more room in his head for logic, for justice, for upholding the law, just anger, fear of losing control, and hatred. Collins sat in the car, motionless, as if challenged. The policeman did not think about the legality of his actions. He didn't feel the need to explain the reason for the stop, much less follow procedures. His irritation was growing by the second, and every glance at Collins's calm face fueled his rage. Instead of simply asking about the reason for the trip or checking IDs legally, Harrison decided to act differently. He didn't need an excuse. He needed a show of force. He needed to humiliate. As he got closer, he tapped the hood of the SUV sharply with his baton, as if that was the signal to start a fight. Get out, Harrison bellowed, his voice sounding like an order that needed no explanation behind it. Collins turned his head, looked slowly at the policeman through the glass, in no hurry to get out. Harrison was on edge. Why is he acting like this? He expected fear, expected panic, but instead he was met with a cold, confident stare that robbed him of any sense of mastery of the situation. I said get out of the car, Harrison shouted, hitting the door with his baton with such force that the sound of the blow echoed in the dark street. But even under this pressure, Collins was in no hurry to obey the order. He turned his head slowly, sighed, and, as if in slow motion, reached for the doorknob. Every movement he made seemed to mock Harrison. This man didn't fear him, didn't respect his authority, and it was blowing the cop up inside. When the door finally opened, Harrison was already on edge. He grabbed Collins' arm and pulled him roughly out of the car, almost throwing him to the pavement. The man still didn't resist, but that only infuriated Harrison more. Why isn't he twitching? Why isn't he protesting? Damn it, why is he so calm? Hands on the hood, Harrison said sharply, no longer trying to hide his anger. His voice was loud, rough, and soaked with contempt. Collins, reluctantly but without further ado, turned to the hood of the car and put his hands on it. His face expressed neither fear nor excitement, and it drove Harrison crazy. He wanted to see the man trembling, to see him begging for mercy, but instead he was confronted by a wall of absolute certainty. "What's going on here?" Collins asked coldly, his voice sounding too calm for the situation. These words made Harrison even more furious. He could no longer contain himself. The same inner monologue played over and over in his head. "You're just a black criminal. You can't be anything else. How dare you say those things to me?" He slapped Collins on the shoulder, pushing him toward the car. Though it wasn't necessary, let him know who's in charge, Harrison thought, feeling the blood rushing through his veins. His eyes threw sparks of rage, his hands clenched into fists. He no longer saw the man in front of him, just the image he'd created for himself. "Listen to me." Harrison grabbed Collins by the collar, pulling him closer to him. "You're not the one asking questions here. You understand? I decide who you are and what you are. You don't belong on these streets." Collins was silent. His silence cut Harrison to the core. He didn't understand why the man in front of him continued to keep his cool. Is he taking the piss? Thinks he can get away with that? Hell no, I'll show him. Harrison's anger grew more and more angry, and he pushed Collins toward the car again, squeezing his arm with such force that the joints creaked. The man sighed restrainedly, but made no attempt to resist. That only fueled the fire inside the cop even more. "You goddamn drug dealer, you think I don't understand anything?" Harrison hissed in his ear, feeling his words becoming more and more absurd, but he couldn't stop himself. "You think your expensive car and your rags mean anything? You're no better than anyone else." Harrison no longer distinguished between reality and his own preconceived fantasies. He no longer saw before him a man, but some archetype of the criminal he believed was poisoning the city. His inner monologue whispered, "He's definitely guilty. He's connected to crime. I can feel it. I know it." Again the baton struck the car. Again the unnecessary thrusts, the rough, humiliating movements, as if Harrison wanted to shake Collins into confessing to a crime that did not exist. "You don't belong here," he repeated, as if that was the only explanation for his actions. Suddenly Collins slowly turned his head and, despite his humiliating position, looked coldly at Harrison. The look was so intense that the policeman was literally out of breath. "You have no idea who you're talking to," Collins said quietly, but there was such steely confidence in his voice that Harrison froze for a moment. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life." The words echoed in Harrison's head. He felt something inside him begin to tighten, as if an invisible force were beginning to penetrate his mind. Collins' words seemed like a prophecy that threatened to come down on him with all its power. But instead of stopping, Harrison only clenched his teeth harder, feeling the anger literally churning inside him. "You're nothing," Harrison said, trying to maintain a semblance of authority. "And you'll realize that soon enough." But in the back of his mind he already realized that the situation was getting out of control, and now that control was held only by his aggression. Harrison wasn't thinking anymore. He was acting on autopilot, driven by rage and a burning need to prove to himself that he was right. Overstepping boundaries? He'd crossed them long ago. In his world, it was simple: a black man in an expensive car, overly confident, meant something was amiss. He didn't need any facts or proof. In his head, everything already came together. This guy is definitely guilty. It just needs to be finalized. He quickly pulled out the handcuffs, the crunch of metal sounding like a final judgment. "Hands behind your back," Harrison said in a tone that left no room for questions. It wasn't just an order, it was humiliation. Collins made no attempt to resist, not even to move. Only his eyes, cold and calm as ice, met Harrison's, and at that moment the policeman felt something inside him break. The man was looking at him as if he could see through him, as if he knew everything that was going on in his head. But Collins didn't say a word, even as Harrison sharply slammed his hands behind his back and handcuffed him with such force that the metal dug into his wrists. His movements were rough, almost brutal, but the FBI agent remained speechless. Harrison shoved him again, forcing him noisily against the hood of the car. "This is an arrest." Harrison spat out sharply, though in his head the words sounded like some kind of justification for his actions. He repeated it more to himself. "You're being held on suspicion of," but he paused. What charges could he make? What evidence did he not have? It didn't matter, though. Power was on his side, and he was going to make the most of it. The law is on my side. I can do whatever I want. It's all justified. The self-assurance in Harrison's head grew amidst the internal struggle. Collins remained calm even under the handcuffs, his gaze just as impenetrable. That spurred Harrison on even more. He expected to see despair, fear, pleas for mercy. But there was none. "You'd better be quiet," Harrison hissed, as if he sensed that this calmness hid something he couldn't control. He pushed Collins toward the patrol car, shoving him with his shoulder as if he wanted to make him feel that he was nothing more than an object of his power. Every movement was rough, deliberately abrupt, as if the policeman were trying to prove his superiority by physical force. Collins stepped forward, but did not quicken his step. His every movement, despite Harrison's pressure, remained slow, almost lazy. This infuriated the policeman even more. He grabbed Collins by the shoulder, tearing it with such force that the handcuffs slammed painfully into the man's wrists, but Collins made no sound. "Come on, hurry up," Harrison growled, pushing him further. "You think you can keep looking at me like that? You think you're special? We see people like you every day." But Collins was still silent. That silence was louder than any words, and Harrison couldn't help it. It was already boiling inside him. He wanted to break this man, to make him realize that he wasn't going to come out of this situation victorious. But instead of fear or submission, Collins was an immovable rock, silent and unreachable. When they reached the patrol car, Harrison opened the door abruptly and threw Collins inside with such force that he nearly hit his head on the door jamb. The policeman slammed the door shut and stared at the detainee's face through the glass. Everything about Collins said that he was not afraid at all. Harrison took a step back, feeling his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to feel satisfaction, power, confidence, but instead a strange restlessness gripped him. The anger wouldn't go away. Collins wasn't supposed to be so calm. This man shouldn't have been so easy to obey without betraying an ounce of fear. A sense of impending disaster was growing inside the policeman. But he had not yet realized how deeply he was mired in his own prejudices. Harrison had no idea what kind of man was sitting in the back seat of his car, and how close he was to ruining not only his career, but his entire life. Harrison slammed the patrol car door so hard it looked like it was about to fly off its hinges. Everything inside him was seething with anger, but his joy at the completion of the arrest was strangely empty. He felt a faint tang of doubt something was wrong here, but he was already in too deep. There was no backing down now, no admitting his mistake. "I've done everything right," he convinced himself. This guy's got to be dangerous, but Collins's calmness shattered his confidence. The policeman felt as if everything around him was spinning out of control, even though outwardly the situation seemed complete. This man was different. And that was disturbing. The policeman turned and went to the driver's side of the car to take the criminal to the station. He could feel his heart pounding, but thoughts of triumph were still echoing in his head. "I've dealt with him, now it's all over." He was already visualizing the report he would tell his superiors of his success, a black man in an expensive car, confident but caught on the spot. And how he, Harrison, had settled the matter in an instant. But before he could open the driver's door, a calm voice came from the car and blew like a cold wind into the back of Harrison's head. "You don't know anything, cop." The words were spoken softly, almost in a whisper, but there was an unshakable confidence in them that immediately caught Harrison's attention. He froze in place, his hand resting on the doorknob. He turned slowly to look again at the detainee. Collins was sitting in the back seat, handcuffed, but his gaze was calm, as if this was just a routine trip, not an arrest. "What did you say?" Harrison growled, trying to maintain control, but his voice shook treacherously. "I said you don't know anything," Collins repeated, his voice sounding like he was talking to a child who was trying to play grown-up games. The policeman felt goosebumps run down his spine. A new fire of rage was burning inside him, but at the same time he felt a cold prick of fear. Something in the man's voice made him forget for a moment that he was in control. Something in his tone was so sure that Harrison felt the ground beneath his feet begin to subside. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," Collins continued. His calm now seemed oddly menacing. "You think I'm just another guy to take it out on, but you're wrong. You just made the biggest mistake of your life." These words, spoken so coldly, knocked the ground out from under the policeman's feet. It was as if all the noises in his head had been silenced at once. He looked at Collins as if he were a ghost, not knowing what to say in reply. All his confident actions, his aggression, his attempts to show his strength, now they looked ridiculous in the light of what the man had said. Harrison felt his heart beat faster. "What the hell is this?" ran through his head. "What does he mean? Who is he anyway?" But instead of acknowledging his alarm, he took a step toward the car and leaned closer to Collins, hoping to overwhelm him with his presence. "Are you threatening me?" he hissed, clenching his teeth. "You think your pretty words are going to scare me? You're in handcuffs now, you understand, and you're going to the station like the rest of them." Collins only grinned. It was too much. That grin was the last straw. Harrison could take no more. It was rattling around in his head. "I've got to break him. Must show him he's a nobody." He opened the car door again and grabbed Collins sharply by the shirt, yanking him out of the car. His movements were rough, abrupt, almost hysterical. But Collins remained absolutely unperturbed. He did not even try to resist, did not complain. His face expressed neither pain nor fear, only that cold, icy calm that made Harrison mad. "You went too far, cop," Collins said, his voice steady even though his hands were bound and his body was being roughly pulled from the car. "And now you're going to have to answer for it." Harrison pushed him again, pinning him against the hood of the patrol car. He was no longer in control of his actions. He wanted to feel the man shake under his hands just once. He wanted Collins to break, to let his confidence evaporate. "I decide who's in charge of what," Harrison shouted, his voice trembling now from his own exertion. But Collins looked at him with such confidence that the policeman's breath caught for a moment. There was no fear in that look. It was as if he were saying, "I'm in control of this situation, not you." "You don't realize who you're talking to yet," Collins said quietly, his voice barely audible. "I'm an FBI agent, and you've just made a huge mistake." Those words struck Harrison like lightning. Everything in his head buzzed. The world around him shook as if his consciousness had been torn apart. "What?" In an instant, his world turned upside down. His every aggressive prank, every humiliation, every movement of the handcuffs, all of it now came crashing down on him with double force. Harrison stood still as if paralyzed. The words FBI agent echoed in his head, shattering everything he'd built up over the years. In an instant, he was no longer master of the situation. "What have I done?" The thought flashed through his mind, but he couldn't bring himself to believe it. He was now on the verge of collapse himself. Collins, once more glaring at him with an icy stare, was still as calm as ever. It was as if he had not just revealed his true identity, but had merely reported another detail of his biography. But there was a threat behind that calm, a threat that Harrison's world was about to collapse. While the tension in the air was building, Harrison's past, which he had tried to bury deeper, came to the surface. It was a dark past that only a few knew about, but with each new incident, the shadows of the past grew heavier. His superiors always turned a blind eye to what were considered little things, complaints from citizens that Harrison was excessively harsh in detentions, especially against minorities. Those who had the temerity to complain about him soon found themselves in unexpected trouble. Cases dragged on, evidence was lost, witnesses recanted their testimony. "It's just a coincidence," Harrison told himself every time he managed to get away with it. His humiliated victims usually didn't have enough resources or connections to fight the system. The system was always on his side. His superiors were more interested in high arrest rates and keeping order than in dealing with complaints about their own employee. Harrison knew how to cover his tracks. He knew how to manipulate a situation so that he could get away with it. Even when he overstepped his authority and beat up detainees, he was always covered. "They're criminals, after all," he reassured himself. "There's no other way to deal with them." But Collins wasn't just another criminal. He was an FBI agent, a man who could ruin Harrison's entire life with a single phone call. And that was the crux of the problem. Now everything he'd been doing for years could come to the surface. Collins sat, handcuffed, but his confidence was almost sinister. Harrison felt himself begin to tremble. He'd never had to deal with men like this before. The fact that he had made such a mistake made him furious, but that fury could no longer be vented. Harrison's mind went back to all his past episodes of abuse of authority. Those moments when he stopped black drivers' cars for no apparent reason. Those times when he conducted searches that should never have happened. The times he physically dominated detainees. Feeling the satisfaction of his power came to mind, and each time he got away with it. Like a charm, it was as if the system was on his side. But this arrest was different. He felt the game was over. Harrison could no longer control the consequences. Everything he had done to this man now threatened to come back like a stab in the back. Complaints that had previously leaked could now resurface with renewed vigor. The disturbing ringing in his head intensified. He remembered the name of Stevens, the black teenager he had brutally beaten for resisting arrest. Stevens had screamed his innocence then, but no one had heard. That it was forgotten. But now every such case seemed to Harrison in a new light. What if Collins brings up all this dirt? Harrison realized that it wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. His reputation and career hung in the balance, and he was helpless. Other names came up: Lewis, King, James, all those people who had suffered at his rough hands and prejudiced judgment. Their voices had never been heard. But now it might be different. What if Collins finds out about this? In a panic, Harrison realized that this FBI agent could ruin everything, not just his career, but his life. Every unresolved complaint, every time his superiors swept a problem under the rug, could have been a weapon against him. This arrest was supposed to be just another successful episode where he used his power to quell a threat, but that's not how it went down at all. Silence covered the scene, and tension hung in the air as bright lights flashed in the darkness. Harrison's patrol car stood at the curb, and he was still clutching the handcuffs in his hands, which now seemed too light as his own certainties. A hurricane raged inside him: fear, shame, and anger mixed into an uncontrollable storm. Suddenly, several vehicles bearing the FBI logo arrived at the scene of the traffic stop, abruptly interrupting his inner torment. The policeman, discouraged, looked at the black SUVs that began to fill the street. Agents in strict suits with credentials stepped out of them, quickly bringing order. Harrison felt a cold sweat run down his back and his heart beat faster. "What's going on here?" one of the agents shouted, heading toward Harrison. His voice was stern and intolerant. Harrison started, but the words stuck in his throat. He couldn't get his head around what was happening. He tried to gather his thoughts, but he realized that any explanation he gave would be useless. "Step away from the car," another agent commanded. Approaching Collins, his eyes were determined. Like a man who knows what awaits him, he quickly and deftly removed the handcuffs from the detainee, freeing him. "It's all right, sir, we're with you." Harrison could not take his eyes off Collins. He seemed so calm that there was not an ounce of tension left in him. The FBI agents began to exchange whispers, glancing at the policeman, who felt trapped. He was in the center of an event that he himself had provoked, and that could turn out to be his downfall. "This is an undercover FBI agent," one of the agents said, addressing his colleague. "He's on an important operation. We've been warned about possible interference." Harrison felt his head spinning. All his notions of control and power had collapsed. He shifted his gaze to Collins, who was finally free. The man looked up at him with such a smile that it looked like he had just gotten out from under a blow. "You have no idea who you've been dealing with," Collins said, looking at Harrison with a slight chuckle. He had a look of superiority in his eyes, and satisfaction that he had prevailed. The phrase cut Harrison. He was beginning to realize that his actions would now be the cause for an investigation, just what he feared most. His misconduct could shake up not only his career, but could get him in real trouble with the law. The FBI agents began asking questions about what had happened, and it soon became apparent from their mouths that Collins' entire operation was aimed at exposing a criminal network that, among other things, used police officers to cover its activities, and now Harrison had become part of that game, albeit unknowingly. "You took on too much, cop," Collins said, as if reading his mind. "You let bias and hate cloud your judgment. That's your problem." Anger boiled up inside Harrison. He was ready to react, but he realized there was no point in doing so now. His actions would be analyzed under a microscope, and what he thought was his triumph would turn out to be a disaster. The FBI agents were gathering evidence, and Harrison, watching their actions, realized that this day was the beginning of the end for him. Every little thing he had ever done would now be tried in court. He became not only a target of scrutiny, but also a target for accusations of racism and abuse of power. "You should have known you wouldn't get off that easy," Collins said, turning to him with a judgmental look. "We're not going to let people like you tarnish the image of the police and endanger innocent lives." The agent's words were like a hammer blow. Harrison, unable to hold back a surge of emotion, felt all confidence drained from him. He now stood before the law, but he himself was under attack. Just when he thought he had the situation under control, his world began to crumble. "You're going to pay for this," Harrison said, but he didn't sound as confident as before. He realized that not only his career, but his life was already up for discussion. Though he was still in a humiliating position, he noticed that Collins did not show an ounce of pity. Instead, his face lit up with the satisfaction of being able to avenge the past wrongs he had suffered from the system. And in that, Harrison felt his deepest fear of being not just a cop, but a villain in the eyes of a system he had once considered an ally. Suddenly several more cars arrived on the scene, and in them were people capable of dealing with serious matters, internal investigators who had probably been informed of the incident. Everything he had kept hidden for so long could now come out. Harrison realized that this was not just an accident, but his destiny, ready to break him. Darkness was gathering around him, and he didn't know how to get out of it. Harrison stood still as if in a vice. A sense of imminent collapse enveloped him as he watched the group of FBI agents who seemed to be conducting their investigations with cold and brutal precision. Every move they made reminded him of the crazy mistake he had made and that the consequences of his actions could be catastrophic. A sense of anxiety was growing inside him, the fear that his life, as he knew it, could collapse in a matter of minutes. "We have every reason to believe that you have exceeded your authority," one of the agents said, slowly approaching Harrison. His voice sounded clear and confident, like a verdict that could not be appealed. There was a fire in his eyes that was ready to consume everything in its path. Harrison wanted to justify himself, wanted to say that he was only doing his duty, that he saw Collins as a threat, but the words stuck in his throat like a lump he couldn't swallow. He realized that those excuses now sounded pathetic and hopeless. He'd arrested a federal agent, and that wasn't just a mistake, it was a crime. The words the agent was saying kept echoing in his head, as if he were repeating them over and over again like an incantation. "You have exceeded your authority." He felt his own beliefs begin to fall apart. Every moment he had used power against others, every instance where he had treated people with contempt, now seemed wrong to him. Voices echoed around him. The agents were asking Collins questions, looking for answers related to his investigation. Every word they said hit Harrison like blocks of ice. He felt his notions of justice and authority begin to crack at the seams. "You don't realize what you've done, do you?" Collins growled, his voice tinged with cold contempt. "Your actions have affected not only your life, but the lives of people who may have been affected by the criminal network we're pursuing. You've become part of the problem." Harrison bowed his head, unable to meet the eyes of his former detainee. He felt the pride that used to matter begin to crumble under the pressure of cruel reality. Every time he made vile jokes about criminals, every time he looked at people with contempt because of their skin color or social status, he was drifting away from his true nature. He mumbled, but the words wouldn't come out. He had no excuses. Every time he went out on patrol, he felt like he was not just a guardian of order, but a master of fate. Now that he had seen the consequences of his arrogance, he felt he had been nothing more than a pathetic enforcer. The FBI agents kept asking questions, and each new revelation took him further away from the certainty that had once defined his life. They began parsing facts he couldn't dispute, complaints from citizens, internal investigations that ended up going nowhere. It was like an endless repetition of his own failures. At that moment he remembered those who had been hurt by his actions. Lewis, who had tried to justify himself but had been beaten for insubordination. Stevens, who only wanted to pass, but was victimized by his prejudice. Others came to mind, victims of his hatred, whom he considered threats without realizing that the threat was actually coming from him. Each new detail that surfaced during the proceedings seemed to be a brand on his conscience. He imagined how he would now be judged, how every one of those he had once humiliated would watch his downfall with satisfaction. "You'll pay for everything," sounded in his head like a rebuke. Now, as Harrison stood before the agents, he felt not like a guardian of order, but a traitor. He had betrayed the very essence of his service. The fear that had once driven him to extreme measures was now his enemy, robbing him of his strength. His thoughts swirled, and he did not know how to deal with this inner conflict. The agent standing in front of him continued to speak, but the words coalesced into one: "You are not worthy of this uniform." Each moment of realization hit Harrison like a waterfall, and he felt that soon his life would change forever. "You have a chance to explain yourself," one of the agents said, looking at him incredulously, "but remember, we record everything, and your words can be used against you." At that moment, as if awakening from a long sleep, Harrison realized that everything he had thought about his status, his role in society, no longer mattered. He was now only a shadow of his former self, a man who had fallen victim to his own delusions. Now he couldn't walk away from his choices, and at the very moment he realized the depth of his fall, he decided that he was ready to take responsibility. I was wrong," he said, finally finding his voice. "I can't justify it. I was blind, and I did terrible things." Inside him, a process of rethinking had begun. Perhaps that was his hope, a chance to start over, a chance to redeem himself, but his actions had already written the sentence, and now he had to accept the consequences. Harrison stood before the FBI agents, and his inner world crumbled like a house of cards. Every word spoken, every reproach, every look filled his mind with pain and the realization of inevitable punishment. What had once seemed to him an undeniable truth, he was a defender of order, a guardian of the law, was now a cruel illusion. His career, which he had built on bias and arrogance, was crumbling before his eyes. The walls he had built around himself began to crack, and he realized that he could no longer return to the person he used to be. Every step, every minute spent at work was now a source of shame. How could he be so wrong, so betrayed? The superiors who had once been proud of his accomplishments now looked at him with disapproval. Harrison knew he was in for a tough trial and probably dismissal, but it wouldn't end there. His actions had already attracted public attention. The resentment and condemnation that he had once readily shown to others now descended upon him, and he could not escape that fate. "You turned into something you hated," one of his coworkers said, standing aside, unwilling even to come close. The reproach was like a knife to the heart, and Harrison felt his pride leave him. Those words had come to symbolize everything he had lost. He had become an example of betraying the values he had once considered important. Internal investigations began quickly. He became the subject of attention, the subject of news coverage. Television reports showed his face, and his name became synonymous with racial inequality and abuse of power. There were whispers behind his back about his failures, about how he had become a symbol of what happens to those who wear the uniform too long without understanding the true principles of service. Every morning when he woke up, he felt the weight of his choices. He was losing friends, the support and respect of his coworkers. Even his family began to distance themselves from him, unable to understand how someone who had once been the pride of their family could sink so low. "We can't hang out with you anymore," his wife said, eyes full of tears as she stood on the threshold, ready to leave. "I can't support a man who behaves like this. You're not the man I knew." Those words were the final nail in his coffin. All the comfort and security that he had thought he had was beginning to disappear. He had lost the ability to protect those who really needed protection, and now he was a victim of the system he had once so confidently defended. Harrison couldn't sleep at night. He wandered the empty streets, looking for solace in the cityscape, but found only silence and cold. In every passerby he saw a reflection of himself, other people's gazes full of bewilderment and dislike. He had become one of those he had once judged, and it was unbearable. Every thought of the future became more and more gloomy. How would he live his life? Would he ever be able to atone for his sins? Would anyone be willing to forgive him? He felt his moral collapse dragging him into an abyss from which there was no return. Finally, he sat down on a park bench and stared up at a sky full of stars. Each one seemed to him a flame of hope, but he knew that his own hope had faded. As a guardian of order, he had always sought justice, but now he realized that his own actions had disqualified him from it. He had become a mere shadow of himself, and as he realized this, he sank into his reflections, helpless and alone. "I was wrong," he said aloud, as if those words could give him back everything he'd lost. "I was blind, and now I'm paying for it." That night, for perhaps the first time in his life, he truly saw what it meant to be human. He realized that all he had left was to start from scratch, and that might be the only path to redemption. But how difficult that would be when the world around him would only remember who he had become. The night Harrison was alone with his own thoughts was a turning point that developed an unprecedented public outcry. In the morning, news programs began broadcasting the high-profile scandal, and his name filled the airwaves once again. The television screen flashed with headlines such as "Police Officer Arrests Black FBI Agent," "Racism in the Police, How Much More Should We Tolerate?" and "Systemic Discrimination, Who Will Protect the Citizens?" The media picked up the story like it was a bottomless spring. In the studios, the voices of experts, activists, and community members rang out, each discussing with fury how Harrison had come to symbolize a problem that many Americans faced. Each new word only added fuel to the fire of anger that was brewing in the community. "This case is a clear manifestation of racism and bias," one analyst stated on live TV. "This is not an isolated incident. This is a systemic problem that needs immediate change." Only a few days later, crowds began to flock to the police department building. People held signs with slogans such as "No racism in the police department," "We all need a fair trial," and "Don't forget the victims." There were shouts calling for reform, and the hearts of the crowd beat in unison as they demanded justice. Harrison watched this from afar, his soul torn with shame. These people who had been so close to him professionally were now turning against him. He realized that his actions had set off a chain reaction that went beyond his personal mistakes. These were real lives, real suffering, real human stories. Some protesters emphasized their own experiences. One of them, a black guy with a microphone in his hand, shouted into the crowd, urging everyone to speak out about their own personal tragedies, how they were denied the right to be heard, how their lives and freedom were threatened just because of the color of their skin. He reminded those who could not speak out against the system, those who remained in the shadows. Each of his words pierced Harrison like arrows. He realized that his personal guilt was no longer just his own. It had become part of something bigger. These protests were not just against him, but against the entire system that allowed bias and hatred to develop. At the same time, a real storm was raging on social media. Posts, photos and videos filled users' feeds. Memes condemning his actions went viral. Discussions about racism in the police attracted the attention of many people, and a topic that had long been in the background came to the forefront. Everything from the lack of racial sensitivity training for police officers to the need to completely reevaluate the structure of law enforcement was discussed. Criticism spilled over into public debates where everyone wanted to share their opinions. Activist groups began organizing rallies, seminars and roundtables on law enforcement reform. Bills began to be drafted to improve control over police actions. Harrison soon learned that a lawsuit had been filed against him. The criminal case, in which he found himself accused of abuse of power and racial profiling, became a topic of discussion in human rights circles. Each new court discussion was covered in the press, and the public held its breath in anticipation of justice. Every morning Harrison woke up expecting new news, new headlines. Every time he turned on the television, he saw his face on the screen, and with it anger, frustration, and protest. He had become a symbol of hate, and it was like a bitter reminder of who he was. As weeks passed, more and more people began to gather outside police-related buildings, demanding an overhaul of the entire system. The rallies grew to large demonstrations, and soon politicians began to pay attention to them. Discussions about police reforms became the agenda. Each word spoken at these rallies strengthened their ranks, each speech raising new questions about how far to go to bring about real change. Harrison realized that the consequences of his actions were not just a localized scandal, but a real wave of change, and as he sat in his apartment, filled with silence and guilt, he knew he had been the catalyst for the change that might be necessary to break the chains of prejudice and hatred. Yet his own life was on the verge of collapse, and all he had to do was watch as his world, built on beliefs and biases, crumbled, leaving only ash behind. When Harrison was called to the office, he was no longer authorized to enter as a gatekeeper. He already knew this was the end. The walls were draped in gray and the atmosphere was filled with a bias he had created himself. In the eyes of his colleagues, he was no longer a protector. He had become merely a symbol of failure, of how bias can ruin not just one career, but the lives of many others. Everyone who had ever encountered him was present at the hearing of his case. His immediate superior, the same man who had once held him up as an example, now looked at him with distaste and disappointment. Harrison's hands trembled as he looked at him. "You really don't realize what you've done," said the chief, his voice sounding like thunder. You have damaged not only your reputation, but the reputation of the entire department. We gave you our trust, and you betrayed it." His superior's words cut him like a blade. He remembered all the days when he had been proud of his uniform, when he had believed his work mattered, but now those memories seemed distant and distorted. He wanted to say something, to explain his actions, but a feeling of powerlessness lodged in his chest. Soon the formal hearing began. The justice meter began counting down the minutes, turning his life into a public spectacle. He stood in the dock, his face a symbol not only of bias but also of the cruelty inherent in a system that allowed people like him to burden others. A state-appointed lawyer readily undertook the task of representing him, but nothing he said could obscure the fact that he was the subject of a conviction. Charges of abuse of power and racial discrimination came one after another. Each witness, whether an ordinary citizen or a friend who had once respected him, became an addition to the portrait of his disaster. "You detained a man without probable cause," said one of the witnesses, whose face Harrison could not forget. It was the same FBI agent he had arrested. "Not knowing that he represented the long arm of the law, you used your uniform as an excuse for your racism, and your actions caused some of us to get hurt." The words hung in the air like a knife edge. Harrison felt the eyes of those present fixed on him with judgment. The words of testimony reflected his own fears and doubts. He knew that his actions were no longer his business alone. They were becoming part of something bigger, part of something that was ruining lives and destroying trust. The evidence presented was the nails in his coffin. The CCTV footage of his brutal and humiliating actions became the most powerful evidence. Judges, prosecutors and even his defense counsel could not ignore the fact that he had not just arrested a man without justification, he had humiliated him, demonstrating his bias and inability to separate facts from stereotypes. As the sentence loomed on the horizon, the pressure mounted. Every day he woke up feeling that the world around him was rapidly disintegrating. Eventually, the verdict came out in the courtroom: dishonorable discharge, criminal charges for abuse of authority and racial discrimination. Not only did he lose his job, but he became a paranoid criminal in the eyes of society. "This sentence should not only serve as a punishment for you," the judge said, his voice sounding like thunder, "it should also send a message to all who serve the law that bias and violence will not be tolerated. We must work to restore confidence in our law enforcement agencies." The judge closed the gavel case, and quiet conversations broke out among those present. Harrison felt the world shrink around him. Every breath, every tear, every whisper directed in his direction became to him invisible chains that clutched his chest. As he left the courtroom, he was confronted by a crowd of journalists ready to make amends for his shame. They asked questions with fury, seeking answers to the topics that plagued him. He could neither answer nor justify himself, but clenched his fists and lowered his head as he walked out to face his new reality. As soon as the doors closed behind him, he realized that his life had been divided into before and after. He was no longer a police officer. He had become a symbol of how bias can destroy a career and a life. Every step he took on this new path forced him to face the shadows of his past again and again. Now he had to live with the consequences. Every day he would remember that one mistake, one moment of bias could lead to the collapse of everything he had ever known. The public no longer looked to him as a defender of order. He had become the embodiment of what needed to be changed. It was only now that he realized his reckoning had begun. Thank you for your attention and for letting this story be a part of your day. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. See you again.